Stole My Heart, The Material of Sacred Bronze from Chola, India. India, A Story Through 100 Objects. In 2012, the President of India awarded her a Padma Bhushan for outstanding contribution to art and education. In conversation with Vidya Dehejia to discuss the treasures in India, we have Tapati Guha Thakurta. Tapati Guha Thakurta is an Indian historian who has written about the cultural history and art of India. Her extensive research work on Kolkata's Durga Puja led to the inclusion in UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage List. May we please have a round of applause for our guests? Over to you.
Okay, do we start straight away? Okay. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Unseasonably warm afternoon, but a very festive day indeed. It's both Republic Day and Saraswati Puja. And it's I think the day is very apposite for discussing a book that we are going to be talking about today, because it really celebrates the diversity, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, and multi-religious diversity of India through a study of objects. And being Saraswati Puja, I was also reminded that it's a special honor to be in conversation with a scholar whose name really speaks to all the learning and erudition that she personifies. It's a great honor to be here today with Vidya Dehejia. We are both meeting after a long gap and after several life-transforming events in both our lives. Vidya Dehejia, over the 50 years that she's really dominated the field, as a university professor, as a museum professional, and as an exhibition curator, has become an institution by herself. And I say this because, not only because the span and range of her work covers such a wide range of fields in South Asian art history, but also because of the way in which she has nurtured the discipline and its changing directions in the USA primarily, but her students really speak of the importance and influence that she's had as a teacher, as a curator, on the field at large. And I'd like to show all of you here a book called The Long Arc of South Asian Art, which are essays in honor of her, brought together by generations of her students, some of whom are prominent academics, museum curators, and important people in different fields of life. This was planned for the occasion of Vidya's retirement, which has just happened, from a position as Barbara Stoller Miller Professor at Columbia. But Vidya's really, I think, has been able to exert a huge impact on training people, and training people not just to be academics, as she says, but training people to learn more about the object worlds that lie, of course, at the source of the field of Indian art history. So what I'd like to do is that to give a sense of the very wide range of Vidya's scholarship, I'd like to read out a small section from the introduction of this book by the editor Annapurna Garimela, who was one of Vidya's students, one of many Vidya students, where she writes, Vidya's career spans more than 50 years, during which South Asian art history has shifted drastically. Vidya, as she prefers to be called by her students, is central to this transformation. Beginning in the caves of Tamil Nadu, 1968, and the Deccan, 1972, moving to early stone temples in Orissa, 1979, a pioneering study of Yogini temples, 1986, British artists in India with Tapati Guha Thakurta in 1986 again. She continued to do more path-breaking work, integrating poetry, sculptural art, and architecture in medieval Tamil Nadu. Patrons and Temples in 1988, Poetry of Tamil Saints, also in 1988, as well as the poetry of Antal and the art of the Imperial Cholas in 1990. In these years, she published books with Indian government presses, private and not-for-profit publishing houses in India, and American academic publishers. Important friendships with other art historians like Tapati Guha Thakurta and Barbara Stoller Miller were deeply impactful on Vidya and fueled her interest in developing lines of inquiry that broke boundaries as much as they delineated objects worthy of study. I read this out because I don't think I could have summed up this extraordinary range of her scholarship, which moved from Buddhist narrative art to Yogini temples in Orissa, from the Chola bronzes, which remains her strongest and foundational work, to cults of the Devi, to looking at India through British eyes, and to looking at different ways of the body in Indian art, and then also on material and medium. So her book called The Unfinished, which looks at the work of stonemasons on works that were not finished, is again a monumental work which she did with Peter Rockwell, a sculptor himself. So Vidya spans all these worlds. The introduction is appositely called The Many Art Histories of Vidya Dehejia. In a wonderful reflections on her own career in the epilogue of this book, Vidya talks about her journey. It's a fascinating journey, much of which was spent walking and knowing India through her different sites. So from Cunningham to her, the best way of knowing India is by walking and touring. And she talks about the difficulties of traveling in those times. Even more, the difficulties of photographing and documentation at times when many of the gadgets we now use all the time were not in place. She talks about how, as an academic, she also wanted to always have a wider public outreach. As a museum curator, as an exhibition person, she always wanted to engage larger publics. At the same time, she also talks about how important it is for academics to enter and immerse themselves in the object worlds that make up the field of art history. So her close attention to material, to medium, to form, to style, to use and reception and patronage really lie at the heart of the book which we're going to discuss today. So this is over to you, Vidya, but I'd like to also just begin by asking you, how easy was it to make this transition from the very scholarly work that you do, very specialized scholarly work that you do, to write this very generalized book through a selection of objects?
Thank you, Tapati. I'm not trying to avoid your question, but this audience knows Tapati and knows what a splendid scholar she is. So I appreciate even more the fact that she had all these wonderful words to say about me. How difficult was it to make the transition? It was actually exhilarating. It was an absolute joy. I really enjoyed it. It was tricky because the book is a picture on one page and 550 words, no more, on the opposite page. And to sum up some of the things I wanted to convey about these objects in 550 words was pretty difficult. I'll leave the audience to decide whether I was able to do it or not. But a story of India through 100 objects. And I have been asked by many people, though probably not by this audience, why objects? And my answer to that would be, but of course objects. You know, we're constantly surrounded by objects. They're in our homes, in our offices, wherever we are surrounded by all these things that enable our life, that channel our lives, that dictate them, things that we often take for granted. But these objects all speak about us. They have a story to tell. a story that sometimes reflects our values, our aspirations, sometimes our fears, often our achievements. And objects reveal more about us than we actually realize. Just think about it. When you go into the home of a person you're meeting for the first time, you look around the room and you automatically make some judgments about what is important for them or what they value. So this book, of course, focuses on 100 objects to tell a story of India. How was I going to organize them? Pure chronology would have been deadly boring. Who is going to read that? Okay. So I chose to let the story unravel in a series of thematic sections. There are 20 of these thematic sections, like the urge to adorn, or the sciences, or yoga. You know, there are different thematic sections. I wanted to let the 100 objects shed light on the varying priorities over time, the different strands of achievement that have created this rich multicultural medley that is today's India. It is a multifaceted culture that has had room, always had room, for different points of view and for varying priorities. That has been India's strength. That is still her strength today. And I hope it will continue to be that way. By the way, I must say it is a story, a highly idiosyncratic story. I'm not sure that there's anything that can be called a totally neutral point of view without being, again, manipulated to be very boring. So I want to start with one of my favorite objects. And this is a small object. It's only about 10 inches tall. It's a gorgeous figure of a yakshi. It's in ivory, and it's absolutely beautiful. It's a sensuous form of the early centuries. And as the next image will show, this ivory piece is the exact counterpart of the stone images on the Sanchi stupa. The interesting thing I want to point out about this image, the ivory image, that it was found where? In Pompeii, in the Roman town of Pompeii. And why Pompeii? As the next image will show, it was inundated by the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius, which erupted in the year 79 of this era. So she had already reached there before the year 79. The first 2 centuries BCE and CE were an age of mercantile enterprise. Huge quantities of pepper, also of other objects, and including ivory, went across to the Mediterranean. We found a Roman recipe book, which has 400 recipes in it, fascinating reading. But the point is that 395 of them use black pepper. And black pepper, of course, is from India. It was part of this trade that this lovely little ivory image went across there. What was her purpose? I am not sitting on that type of chair, but at home, the chair I lean on has got slats at the back, vertical slats. And that is what she seems to have been. She has adorned the chair of a Roman nobleman somewhere before the year 79. And it is an extraordinary confirmation of the fact that India was never isolated from the rest of the world. It was always in contact. If we go to the next image, this, of course, this figure in the classic yogic pose, cross-legged in meditation, is India's unique contribution to the vocabulary of world art. And as the next 2 images will show you, it dates back over 4,000 years, long before Patanjali wrote his Yoga Sutras, because Indus Valley seals, which are, say, roughly 2600 to 1900, show us the figure seated in a Padmasana with his hands reaching out towards to touch his knees. Yoga poses like this, if you call it necessarily a yoga pose, arose in a country in which it was comfortable to sit on the ground. And when you were raised up on a throne, like the image on the upper left, you just sat on the throne as if you were sitting on the ground, not acknowledging that gap between the seat and the ground. The next slide I put on because it has become quite customary for people these days to say that standing yoga poses are very late. But if I could have the next slide, please. You will see that on the great cliff at Mahabalipuram, which is no later than about 700, we already have 2 standing poses. And the next slide will show you a detail of these 2 images. The actual real ascetic on the far left in front of Shiva, and the false ascetic cat down below. Also in what we call Vrikshasana or tree pose or whatever we call it. And that incidentally suggests that humor as such was not something isolated, even if it was a so-called religious site. If I could have the next slide, please. Across India, we have images of God and his consort as a divine married couple. There is great emphasis on their intimacy, and a detail, if I could have it, will show you how Parvati is seated with her hand around his shoulder and resting on his neck. Shiva's arm goes around Parvati and cups her breast. And you could wonder, these images are everywhere. They are in the Himalayan foothills, they're in the deep south, they're in western India and Rajasthan, across central India, into East India as here, and this is of course a 6-foot-high image that you're looking at. What was the purpose of these? The purpose you have to think of in terms of prasad. And the point is that we have a lot of inscriptions which are suggesting exactly this. Inscriptions say 1201 at Kalinjar in Uttar Pradesh says, "May Shiva, who experienced the delight of an embrace from Parvati, give you excess delight." Another one says, "May Lakshmi, whose hand is caressing the neck of Vishnu, may that hand give you delight." Think of it in terms of the idea of prasad. When Hindus go to a temple, you're going to take a tray of offerings with you. Your offerings may be bananas, a half coconut, some blossoms. Symbolically, the priest offers it to the deity, then gives you back a little portion of it, maybe 1 blossom or one banana. Think of these images and of the verses that are composed about the marital bliss of these divine couples in terms of prasad. The person who is dedicating that verse, or the person who is commissioning that image and offering it to the temple, is asking for a little bit of that back again. It is bliss in marriage that is being stressed here. And of course, what better way to show it than to show your divine couples embracing in this manner. If I have the next slide, please. 0. 0 is nothing, but it is that indispensable nothing. Nothing that we have today. No cell phones, no computers, nothing would be possible without 0. You've got this absolute nothingness, and then at the other end of the scale, you've got ananta, the infinite. So you've got shunyata, absolute nothingness, and the infinite. And the interesting thing is that India and Indian thought and Indian mathematics, but Indian thought first, could embrace both these very, very different types of concept, nothingness and everything. Is 0 only an Indian innovation? Well, in a way, yes. And I say in a way because Babylonia, ancient Babylonia, had room for a placeholder, but it wasn't a number. And the ancient Mayans had place for a placeholder. They had a placeholder indicated by a shell, but it was not a number. it was India that thought of the 0 as a number that they could add to any other number, which would move it one place to the left and would increase it by a factor of 10. So that you added a 0, and of course it's 70, 700, 7,000, and so on. So it is, in fact, an Indian innovation in that sense, absolutely. If I have the next slide. This is a muraka, from a muraka, an album of Mughal Emperor Jahangir. And why do I show it to you? Partly because it has, of course, a painting of Christ carrying the cross at the bottom, right? Well, what is an album page? You can think of it as the sort of, what should I call it, scrapbooks that your parents or even you may have put together when you go something special. You go on a trip, you have photographs that you paste in, you went to a spectacular dance performance, you put the program in. That is what these murakas are. They are, of course, created by the royal artists for Jahangir. They know what he likes. The Jahangir is by one artist. It's been cut out and pasted there. The Christ on the cross is by another artist. His name is on the right. They pasted it all together. The skillful artists have then created white margin, then a margin with cartouches, with writing, then a third margin again. And of course, why is Christ on the cross there? Because it was his father, Akbar, who first invited the Jesuits to the court. And the Jesuits came with the, what is known as the Antwerp Polyglot Bible. And they asked their artists to copy images from the Bible. It's not that they were interested in converting their faith, but they were interested in learning more and showing that they knew about these other faiths. If I have the next image, what we have here is a tombstone, an Islamic tombstone, made in Kambat in Gujarat. Gujarat in the 13th to 15th centuries was under Muslim rule. What is extraordinary about this and other similar marble gravestones is that they were found all across the Indian Ocean rim. This was not found in Kambat itself. It was exported from Kambat. So this one is in Aden, but we've got them in Sri Lanka. We've got 12 of them in the island of Sumatra. We've got some in eastern Java. When you move to the other side of the Indian Ocean rim, you've got them in Yemen, you've got them in Mogadishu, you've even got them in southern Lars, which is the southern province of Iran. So between the 13th and 15th century, these marble tombstones, which were made in Kambat, were highly prized. We know who commissioned them because the name of there's beautiful writing. The calligraphy matches the best of calligraphy anywhere in the Islamic world. And it, of course, tells you that it might have been a sultan, it was sometimes an imam, it was sometimes a wealthy merchant who commissioned it as his own gravestone. Once again, India really was in contact. If we think of globalization as something of the 20th century, let's think again, it's been there since with 479 of this era, and of course, here's yet another example of that sort of thing. The next slide is going to be my last one to show you right now. I'm sure that each one of you has a very different idea of what contemporary art is or should be or could be. But I'm sure that very few of you think of it as standard, just good old ordinary rope. It's just a rope that Mrinalini Mukherjee has dyed into absolutely wonderful colors. Then when it's dry, she twists them, she knots them, she builds them up from the base up. She doesn't seem to have used any preliminary sketch. She allowed the image to form. There was, of course, a removable armature in the middle. But with one scholar has described her work as that of finger-aching ingenuity. It was hard work, working it entirely with your fingers, with nothing else. And they are quite amazing. Many of them are twice life-size. Often she made no more than one in a year. But she was certainly, another moniker given to her is Mistress of Texture. But let me stop there and hand the mic over or give it back to Tapati so that we can talk a little bit more. I'm sure she has things that she'd like to query.
No, thank you, Vidya, for this wonderful selection you made out of the book, which brings us into the present in some sense. One of the things to note is that while we think of these objects all being art treasures, what's very interesting is often the more ordinary, the more everyday kind of objects that also enter the book. So the book begins with the Indian passport and 2,000 rupee notes, which have unfortunately become defunct after the Notbandi. And it ends with things like the mobile phone, the postage stamp, and a series of such things. Now, I think that is itself interesting that you expand the range of what we think are objects of value and worth from what we understand to be those which are collectible as museum objects and or as art objects to a much wider range. And I think that is the very important bit of this book, as with many other books, and I'll come to that later, which have tried to tell stories of world civilizations, of a particular museum, or of a nation through a selection of objects. So that is one. The book begins with a hand axe of the megalithic period, and it almost ends with the mobile phone. So this is the kind of range that Vidya travels chronologically from prehistory into the present. I wanted to ask you a bit about a geographical journey that your objects take us through. What you showed us, you take us from the coasts of India to Aden, to Africa, to Pompeii. And elsewhere in the book, we will move to Southeast Asia, which is a very well-known journey that Indian art and mythology undertakes in the lands of Java, Bali, and Cambodia. So you do talk about India's overseas kind of journeys of objects. I'm also thinking, say, of a section, as you say, the book has sections, and some sections has a few more objects than others, but each section has a chronology. So, for instance, there's a section on kingship and courtly culture, which takes us from a very early image of Buddha as Chakravartin from Kashmir, and it takes us to images of Krishnadeva Raya in Tirupati, and on to Mughal miniatures and the Gulero, the Pahari courts. So we see a chronology, but we also see a geographic reach. For instance, as the section on kingship will talk about the Ganga, Narasimhan from Orissa. It will go further south. So there's an attempt all through the book to not just think of a representative chronology, and what we mean by representative can, of course, always be debated, how representative, but to understand a journey across a mapped space that we today know as India, or that was even larger under British India. Now, I was wondering, how conscious were you of covering different areas as you took us through this journey of objects? And the one area that somehow is not quite present is the Northeast. So it's something that I was thinking of, that I think there is one Naga beaded belt that you use, but there are the difficulties, and I think we need to address the difficulty on why certain regions are not automatically coming within a range of historically researched objects. So if you could speak to that a bit.
Yes, there was no doubt that chronology as such is important. It's an anchoring point. But I didn't want it to rule the book. But within the thematic sections, it also became evident that you really did need to give your readers something to hang everything on, and that dates and chronology mattered, that they were not the most important thing, but that a chronological thing within the sections. So yes, chronology is definitely there. And yes, I was conscious very much of I had this desire we are such a large country, and there was no doubt that one should not leave out entire areas. And yes, it almost seems like tokenism, but I do have a beautiful Naga belt, which I then thought about and said, maybe the best place for this is in the segment called The Urge to Adorn, which is a universal urge, but it is even more important in the context of India. It has much more significance than just ornament. I had a lot of trouble with South Indian bronzes. I kept removing them from the book. I just had to. It was difficult. I don't have a Nataraja in this book. There were certain things which I said are too close to my work, and I must make sure that I don't overdo those. So those were removed.
They're there. They're there in the ideal body. They're there in the ideal feminine body.
At least two.
They're there.
I think it may be only two.
Yeah.
You might find a third.
Because they're everywhere else in Vidya's work. So you're forgiven that. Yeah. Okay.
So yes, it was tricky, and one kept saying, okay, at least I can bring it in. The problem with some of that material from the Northeast, that it exists in the form of dance, or it isn't in material which has survived and which one can show. So, Manipuri dance. And how to do that. Could we do it with just costumes? It was a very tricky
Now, related
issue.
to that is something I wanted you to reflect on. The book mentions in great detail the provenance of each object, date, region, possible artist if known, patron, and then collection. And it did strike me that the bulk of the objects here are sourced from collections abroad, from various museums abroad, British Museum, the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha seems to have had a huge reserve of things for you. And only occasionally, and usually often they are in situ objects, like a wonderful cannon in Bijapur with a lion face, which is actually in a fort in Bijapur. Then there are these copper plate grants, or these wonderful public record instructions of the Chola temple, which are clearly in situ in India. But by and large, it's not objects from India that features in this book. I know this is a huge problem with exhibition and museum curators now on what can travel from India and what cannot. And I think some of us have addressed that problem. So what may have been easier to access? So I'm wondering about the fact that most of the objects in the book are sourced from collections which are not in India. How would you respond to that?
You're absolutely right in what you're commenting. And it's almost entirely one reviewer suggested that all our wonderful objects are overseas, and that is of course not so. But our public institutions, our museums have not photographed all the objects. When you ask to go in and get special photographs taken, it is generally refused. You can't even turn off the lights so that the glass case doesn't reflect the lights in them. When I was working with my Chola bronzes, we at the Tanjavur Art Gallery, we cleaned, I sent my husband out to get colin and paper to sort of clean the cases so that we could take images. And then we realized that the dust was inside the case as well. So it's very, very difficult to get quality photographs. And it seemed very much easier to find the same object or very similar object in a foreign museum where they have already done the photography. They may charge you for it more than you want to pay, but that's about it. And a lot of things are what they call public asset, public domain. So you can download it straight away and use it. So the decision to take objects which were in foreign collections was pretty much ruled by the practicalities of the situation.
No, it speaks a lot to the situation that we work with in India. Because as somebody, of course, I don't work on early periods of Indian art, but I do work with museums, and I know how difficult it is. I work on the history of museums, and I know, therefore, that while all the resources are here, access and the openness for scholars to enter collections, to go into stores, it's a reflection. And I say this as somebody based out of here, working out of here. It's a struggle to access even things which are in your own city all the time. And therefore, I can understand what the practical problem that guided it, but it did strike me. And this is where I want to now bring in a final question before we open it to the audience, is to say that your book, India, A Story Through 100 Objects, is now become part of a booming genre of these kinds of books, which was begun in a way by Neil MacGregor's book, A History of the World in 100 Objects, which itself began as a BBC radio program, where people spoke about objects and listeners had to imagine them without seeing them. It was a challenge. And that led to MacGregor's book, which almost unapologetically celebrates Britain's ability to hold the objects of the world in the museum. So in a way, at a time when there was a lot of criticism of the Universal Museum status, Neil MacGregor's book, wonderful book, comes as a very powerful affirmation and defense of British Museum's ability to hold world objects in its custody. But following that, there's been a spate of books of Indian museums. So I know that Richard Blurton sitting here, he did something on India, A History in Objects from the British Museum again. The Bhaudaji Museum has a book on... so museums are choosing to profile their collections through this format. And a latest book is one by Sudeshna Guha, which has just come out by Hachette, which is called India. In this case, she falls short of 100. It's called 75 Objects. And it's again, follows a chronology. And I was struck to see how some of the objects appear in both your books. And I'm not surprised. It's an Ashokan pillar. It would be a Sarnath Buddha. It could be the Mamalapuram relief sculpture. Tipu's tiger. You know, some of these very iconic images are there across both books, but the approaches are different. Now, I would ask you, what do you think is the currency of this kind of book, given that it's no longer one? There are so many of these coming out. Did you find that a challenge? Because as you were writing, there were all these... Richard was writing his book, and Sudeshna was writing her book. Maybe you all were not aware that you were writing these similar books. But I'm now asked that, what would be the currency of this form anymore, of talking about a history, whether of a museum or of a country or of world civilizations, through this form of the 100 object?
I think that it may have had its day. I don't think that one should be doing it anymore. On the other hand, my publisher, Rowley Books, says that they're going to do a history of 100 monuments and that they're going to do a history of 100 paintings. So it is there.
Did it come to you as a publisher's commission?
Yes, it came
Or
to
was it
me.
your idea?
It came to me as a publisher's idea, to which I was very receptive because I thought Neil McGregor had done such a brilliant job. I mean, what a task! The history of the whole world in 100 objects. I asked them at the British Museum. I was just talking to Richard today, and said, Are you going to bring out a book of 100 objects on India?" And they said, "No, you go ahead and do it." I didn't realize, and his was obviously not commissioned by the museum, so it was there. There's another book that I should mention, which I find absolutely riveting. I read it on the plane from Goa to Calcutta, and I didn't put it down. I couldn't put it down. And that was Nayanjot Lahiri's Timepieces. She calls it a whistle-stop tour of ancient India. And it is so readable, and its segments are different. It is sort of love, food, death, in a different way. I was very struck by the way she has handled that material. I like the idea of objects because for far too long historians have thought in terms of actual archival material. It's always been textual material. They are, of course, now starting to use visual material quite extensively, but there was a tradition of archival material being the centerpiece. And it's nice to see that there are other books that have sort of come out now which are sort of centering the object and what it can tell.
Didn't you do a series on 100 monuments with Mark? No.
No.
I thought you were doing like a video series introducing different monuments.
They did a series of 8 films.
Okay, 8 films.
8 films
8 films.
on different parts of India. So a different sort of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No,
But
suddenly I feel that it may be nice for me to review 2 or 3 of these books and see how they speak both to each other, but how they also move in different directions. I think it's quite a challenge now. There's Richard's book, I have Sudeshna's book, I've just received a PDF, and of course I have Vidya's wonderful book, which I'm going to get her to sign. I think we can now, we have 10 minutes, and I think rather than me take up any more time and conversation, I would ask those of you who've seen the book, those of you who just could be responding to what Vidya has already presented, the floor is open.
they have to give the mic. Takes time. Get the mic there.
Hello, ma'am. It was wonderful to be seeing this. I haven't had the chance to go through this book, definitely, but from what I hear and understand is that you definitely have had a lot of trouble just trying to get the information from Indian museums than what you had for foreign museums. So from a perspective of an author and people who can actually influence, don't you think it's about time that Indian museums are at par with the standards that are maintained in the foreign museums as well, and so that these pieces of work, which are definitely historically and a part of our tradition and culture, should be kept in the way that they are and be reflected in the proper light, not just for you or us, but for the world to see, so that people from outside come and say, "Hey, have you seen these statues in the Indian Museum? It's wonderful." We should be at par on the global frontier. So would you be, open to make such suggestions so that,
Oh, absolutely, you're right. But it is a difficult suggestion to make because it sounds, first of all, like a criticism, which it is, but we don't want it to sound like a criticism. But you're absolutely right. If every museum, let's start with the National Museum in New Delhi, which doesn't have any of its paintings. It's got a huge painting collection. None of them have been digitized in any way. They don't even have a catalog of them online. It just doesn't exist. And we can start just with digitizing in museums, which would then be available. I absolutely agree, but it's a tough one.
No, it's worth mentioning here that Sudeshna Guha's book actually works quite a lot with the National Museum collection. I think she had a fellowship and was based there. So I think there is a large representation, particularly of Harappan material, but other material too. One could do similar. So think of the two largest museums, Indian Museum, Calcutta, and National Museum. I think it's very possible that one can do it. There is a book on the Indian Museum called Lives of Objects, which Indira Chaudhary did for its bicentenary, which takes us through the collection in a very different way through the history of the museum itself. So I think there are lots of possibilities that we can work with. It's not that there's completely no access either. So, but it is a difficult bridge to cross. I would agree with you there.
Okay, so would your list have been different if you had access to the Indian museums? Are there things that you regret leaving out? Are there any? Could you share something that should have been there but couldn't?
There were always decisions to be made. You have to include, say, the Buddha. Should I go with a wonderful crystal relic casket that contained relics of the Buddha, which is in the Victoria and Albert Museum? It's not necessarily an India versus overseas, but there were decisions that had to be made. Or should I go with this wonderful image of Buddha as a Chakravartin, which comes from the Musée Guimet in Paris? Should I go with, there were those sorts of decisions. One had to leave something out. I mean, for Sikhism, should I go with Ranjit Singh's wonderful throne, which I finally decided not to use, because I thought about it and I said that would be more in place perhaps in royalty and kingship. But I wanted to talk about the Sikh faith. Should I go with an image of the Golden Temple in Amritsar? I finally went with a silver parasol, which has images on the side, which would have sheltered or been above the Granth Sahib in a Sikh temple, so in a Gurdwara. So there were a lot of choices. I can't put my finger on one single object like that I would definitely have liked to use. And then one was also thinking, there's the Kohinoor. It's been completely transformed, and yet you couldn't leave it out in a manner of speaking because it's such a well-known item. Why is the Kohinoor not there type of thing? So choices were difficult.
Okay. Sure. Okay. So I didn't realize this. Okay. So that's fine. I thought we had till 5:10, but it's okay. Right. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much, Vidya.
Thank you.
Really being able to have this session with you.
Tapati, it was an absolute pleasure for me to be on the podium with you. It was a pleasure.